Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has fended off a military coup, seen off countless opponents at the polls, and rewritten the constitution in his own favour. But his hold on power may be reaching a critical juncture. Tens of thousands of people have been protesting against the arrest of Erdogan's most powerful challenger yet, Istanbul Mayor Ekrem Imamoglu. He was the favourite to go up against Erdogan for the presidency in 2028 until his arrest. We're joined by the Istanbul-based correspondent Ayla Jean Yackley, a regular guest and a frequent expert on our Turkey tours. Hello and welcome, Ayla.
Hello. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. I suppose the big question here is can Turkey remain a democracy? Already, strong authoritarian tendencies, as we know. It's something we may or may not draw a conclusion of by the end of this session. But first of all, Ayla, what's the latest? The protests have sort of dissipated a bit, haven't they?
That's right. For a week straight, the opposition party called on supporters to join it outside of City Hall in central Istanbul to protest the arrest. And initially, they said they were going to stay there until the mayor was released from jail. But he has now been remanded to custody, and he's incarcerated in a prison that's about 80 miles west of Istanbul. It's actually home to several other political dissidents. And the party has since decided that it wants to strategize, come up with a new strategy for sustaining the energy behind the protests. Namely, some of the things that it has done is it has called for a boycott of companies that are close to the government, especially those that own media properties, such as television stations that aren't broadcasting or covering the protests. And it's also started a signature drive to draw up a petition to ask the government to hold early elections before they're scheduled in 2028. So we see that the opposition is sort of changing tactics. It's understandable because, protesting day after day requires a lot of energy, and it's unclear how long the government would tolerate those continuing.
Okay, so the question really about how much they can survive and the momentum behind them. But before we get into how big a threat this is, if you like, to Erdogan, why has this happened now? I mean, the elections are way off.
It's a great point, and it's something that had a lot of people scratching their heads. But it does come after a few months in which the government had been intensifying a clampdown on the opposition. Imamoglu, the mayor of Istanbul himself, had been facing, I think the total count was 5 criminal cases, totaling up to 23 years in prison and a political ban. Most of those were filed against him this year. So his arrest was a culmination of this ongoing crackdown on the opposition. And the best answer that I can offer as to the timing seems to be actually more the international context. So with Trump in the White House, Erdogan is working with a U.S. president that he knows well from his first term. They had a good working relationship. I think he's also confident that Turkey's human rights record is not at the top of Trump's agenda of concerns in Turkey. In fact, just 3 days before Imamoglu was arrested, Erdogan and Trump held their first call since he returned to the White House. They'd spoken since the election, but that was the first time since the inauguration. And, we don't know what they talked about, and it's probably unlikely that Erdogan would have run this past him. I don't think he would have done that. It's hard to say. But whatever transpired in that conversation, he clearly felt comfortable enough to 3 days later take out his main opponent, who opinion polls showed was outperforming him. And then if we also stick with that international context, we have to look at Europe. And Turkey's stock has risen recently in Europe as well, mainly because of the crisis in Ukraine. As the U.S. has stepped back on Ukraine, And Europe has come to terms with the fact that it's going to need to bolster its own security architecture and have some kind of deterrence effect for Russia. Turkey becomes infinitely more important because it, first of all, it has NATO's second biggest standing army. It has a sophisticated defense industry. It has actually supplied drones to Ukraine from the beginning of the war, which initially were very important for Ukraine in those early days. So I think that Erdogan's confidence in doing this was, at least in part, came from his sense that he and Turkey are just too important for a Europe and a US that are distracted with their own issues and other security issues to worry about the state of democracy in Turkey.
But this is something quite different, isn't it? If you go back to 2013, you had the Gezi protests, the Gezi Park protests, which were a sort of a mass movement, sparked off by people. This is different. He's gone after the main opposition party, the Republican Party, the CHP. This is the legacy party of Ataturk. This is a big party machine. It's really taking on the only democratic opponents to him.
It's an excellent point. I mean, that's what makes this so unprecedented. Erdogan has jailed other political opponents. In fact, Selahattin Demirtas, a Kurdish politician who challenged him for the presidency in 2014 and again in 2018, has been in prison since 2016. He ran his second campaign against Erdogan from a prison cell. He has jailed more than 150 elected mayors since 2016, almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them from, again, the Kurdish party. This is the first time, as you said, he's gone after the main opposition. I mean, this is a party that represents roughly half of the population, in addition to it affecting much more people, therefore, because much more people support this party. It also goes against, I think that the party does have a level of, even if people don't vote for them, they have a level of sympathy because it's the party that Erdogan founded. I'm sorry, Ataturk, slip of the tongue, the party that Ataturk founded, who's a hero to most Turks. So it definitely, it goes beyond what we'd seen before. And also, I think it's really important to say that it also affects, how should I put this? But I think this is an important point. So if you give me a second, I think oftentimes the way that this particularly authoritarian system, but this is true of others as well, a little bit of oxygen is needed in the room. So, Erdogan has been in power and mostly unchallenged since 2003. But there was a valve, let's say, for the opposition. They could still elect their own mayors. They could still, cast a protest vote by voting for an opposition mayor. Now, the message that some of these people may be getting is that's not even an option. Like, there's no room, really, beyond the ruling party. I think Erdogan would strongly discount that. I mean, actually, they do discount all of this. They say this is the judiciary operates independently. This is a legitimate investigation. There's a lot of reason to think that that might not be true, and we can talk about some of the specifics. There seems to be, it doesn't seem to be the strongest case against the mayor. But I just think it's an important point to say that, this isn't by any means, there has been space to have an opposition. And that's, I think, in a way, allowed people to sort of, deal with, okay, they're not happy with the guy in Ankara, but there's decisions on the local level that they feel that they do have more control over. And I think that poses actually a risk for Erdogan himself. I mean, if people feel like they have no other option, if the ballot box is no longer, I mean, Imamoglu was just elected a year ago. And now he's being removed from office, and thrown in jail. It might give people a greater sense of hopelessness with the system.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about Imamoglu. I mean, for me, perhaps he represents some of those ideals that Erdogan, or the appeal that Erdogan had back when he came to power in the early 2000s. This he's essentially quite conservative. He's the family business, working hard. There's that sort of Anatolian, the background to him. So he would have appeal to the masses, and I guess also that those people who were AKP stalwarts back then might be a bit sort of looser now. They might not be so aligned to Erdogan as they used to be.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, they have a lot in common, Imamoglu and Erdogan. They're both from the Black Sea. They both come from relatively conservative backgrounds. They both played amateur football, and they're both elected national mayor. They both, reached the national stage, or international stage for that matter, by winning Istanbul. Erdogan was mayor from 1994 to 1997. He too lost his job because he was jailed. He spent 4 months in prison in the late 1990s for a conviction for inciting hatred over a poem that he had recited. And then went on.
At the time, it would be the Republican Party in power at the time.
Not the Republican Party exactly, but more of that sort of secular establishment. The Republican Party hasn't been in power except for a very brief stint since the late 70s, actually, not in Ankara, but more mainstream, again, secular parties were the ones who dominated Turkey up until Erdogan's sort of Islamist-rooted party came to power in 2002. And one wonders, does Erdogan look at Imamoglu and think, he could follow the same path that I do? The risk is that by jailing him, he's also created this sort of narrative of the victim around Imamoglu, which is something that Erdogan definitely benefited from when he ran for national office in 2003. So, yeah, that's an important point, that they do share this common background. And I think that it is what has allowed Imamoglu to appeal to so many different segments of society. That's very important. Like a lot of places, Turkey is deeply polarized. The fault lines here run in several different directions, though. You've got, religious conservatives and secular Republicans, I'll call themselves, people who adhere to Ataturk's values of a secular republic. You've got nationalists, you've got leftists, you've got the Kurds. And Imamoglu was able to appeal to people from all of these different segments. He has his religious credentials. He has his nationalist credentials. He represents a secular opposition. And importantly, he also reached out to Kurds, which the sort of mainstream parties oftentimes had turned their backs on them over the insurgency in southeastern Turkey since 1984, sort of dismissing 15 million citizens as potential separatists. A lot of people treat them as second-class citizens. So that's what made Imamoglu special. And I suppose perhaps in circles around Erdogan also made him a bit dangerous.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking, what does the CHP, the Republican Party, have on its side? I mean, it's got a massive network, a huge organization. That alliance with the Kurds, I can see, would be seen as a big threat by Erdogan. Where do they go from here? I mean, they've called for a boycott of the economy. This sounds a bit sort of, a bit risky to me.
Yeah. It'll be really interesting to see. We're waiting as journalists to figure out what comes next. They do have a large network behind them. They do have a lot of momentum. I mean, there is a general sense that this goes too far, that you don't take out the candidate for the Republican People's Party. One big challenge, and I think it's worth noting, is that, Imamoglu was arrested with dozens of other people and effectively his brain trust. I mean, these are the people that helped him win election in 2019 when he was relatively unknown. And again, last year in March of...
Re-elected with a big majority.
Big majority. He won by almost 12 percentage points over Erdogan's handpicked candidate. A member of Erdogan's cabinet was defeated. But when they arrested Imamoglu, they didn't just round up random people from the municipality. They, for instance, one of the people that's been detained and jailed along with him is the head of a think tank, and he's one of Turkey's leading intellectuals, and he was part of a think tank and was consulting with the municipality and helped apparently, from what I understand and what I know of him, was helping helping Imamoglu court the Kurdish vote, for instance, ways of appealing to them. So that's probably that's all that I say. All of that to say that the CHP is weakened without him and without the circle around him. I mean, it's Imamoglu who, the party absolutely, of course, it carries cachet, but its share of the vote has been stuck at about 25% for roughly the last 2 decades. And in last year's local election, it was able to increase its share of the vote nationwide, across the country, to roughly about 37%, which was more than Erdogan's AKP party. It was the biggest setback for Erdogan. And so Imamoglu has been credited with a lot of that. We have to now see, does the party, can it manage without this charismatic person, leading, as well as the people behind him. But as far to talk about the economic boycott, so what they've done is they've called for a boycott of companies that are close to the government, specific companies. And then over the last week, students organized what they called a consumer boycott. So yesterday they said nobody spend any money on anything. And I don't think we'll ever get a measure of how successful that was. I mean, all you can do is sort of go to, a shopping district and look around and see how busy or not it was yesterday. From what I saw, it was quiet, but there was also the Eid holiday here as well. So it's hard to say. There are risks to this. There's just a story out this evening about how the Istanbul prosecutor has arrested about a dozen people in connection with this economic boycott, probably people who were maybe promoting it. I think actually a prominent actor was among them. Maybe he must have, I'm assuming, and I can check, must have to do with social media posts. So that on one hand shows that it's risky, but it also shows that the government's concerned about it. If they're actually arresting people for calling for a no consumption day. There is some talk of trying to organize labor a bit, but labor's been quite sidelined for a long time here in Turkey. But if they could somehow organize a walkout, that might be another strategy. But these are all things that we're going to see there. The party has a challenge that it needs to rise to. It's been very comfortable being in the opposition for a very long time, and we'll have to see.
I think I want to run through 3 elements and take a bit of time on each one.
Sure.
So I think they're sort of critical to understanding the environment and who favors which favors who, as it were. One, you've had a terrible economic situation. You've had very high inflation, exacerbated by Erdogan's own policies. The second point is so that would be against that's a sort of troubling background for Erdogan and gives the opposition favour. But the state is immensely powerful in Turkey. If you go back to the coup, I can't remember when it was. Which year was the coup? 2016. He cleans out the security apparatus. Anybody who's vaguely got a taint of opposition is locked up, including teachers. Cleans out the security services, the army, big clear out. So they presumably are very, very loyal to him. And then lastly, there is the media environment, and this is possibly 50-50. The state media the media environment is overwhelmingly pro-Erdogan, but there are many other ways to communicate, we all know, and social media, people are watching TikTok and YouTube and whatever. So can you just go through those sort of one by one? First of all, let's talk about the economy.
Absolutely. That is Erdogan's weak point. And that's why his approval ratings are falling. That's why his party did so poorly in last year's local elections. We have inflation that is running at about 40%. And that is...
How do you deal with 40%? What would you do with 40%?
Well, we're glad it's 40% and not 85%, which it was about a year and a half ago. And economists estimate that it's probably twice the official rate.
Wow.
They change their basket of goods as it helps them. So it's really difficult. I mean, this has hit people across the board. I mean, it's most obviously the most vulnerable people are pensioners, people who earn minimum wage. A third of Turks earn the minimum wage. And I think roughly about half of Turks earn something around minimum wage, a little bit more, maybe.
But I guess the question is that if Imamoglu can provide them with hope and the idea that change is real, but if he's locked up and there's no hope, why bother?
Why bother? But just another point, like just to show you how severe this is, you've got a third of the workforce earning minimum wage. That minimum wage is below the hunger threshold for a family of four. God. So it's just, people are really, really struggling, and it's been going on for a very long time. And Erdogan has, because he's he has so much power concentrated in his office, and he's taken responsibility for economic progress when it happens. He's also being blamed for the situation.
Because this is the guy who brought about huge economic boom, creation of a massive middle class, enormous movement of people from the countryside to the cities. They were Erdogan's people. They're the people who really gave the AKP the bulwark of its support. So if that's dissipated, if that's been eroded, that's really bad news.
That is. So that's been a major factor behind this. And then your second point about state power, I think it's a really, really important point. So, there were, and that actually goes to the media as well. There were pockets of people, both in state institutions and in the media, people that were able to be critical, obviously. But after the 2016 coup attempt, anybody who was deemed disloyal, and it wasn't just the group that was blamed for the coup. For instance, again, Kurds suffered quite a bit in 2016, having their learning language institutes shut down, losing their jobs at universities. But that purge was thorough. It was complete, and it pretty much just hobbled the role of opposition, the opposition voices at, say, universities or at think tanks or in civil society. Those people are all gone. And that's a big difference between now and the 2013 Gezi protests. The opposition is so much smaller and weaker than it was because people have just left, like they're not in the country anymore. So you're right. I think an important note here is that Erdogan does share power, actually, with the Nationalist Movement Party. They only get about 10% of the vote, but they're an ultra right-wing nationalist party. And the way that their governing partnership has been described to me is that Erdogan's party, the AKP, is kind of in charge of public relations. Like they're the ones who build the relationship with voters and are the sort of the face of this government, and are who you, like anybody else, who you associate with running the government. I mean, it's an informal governing partnership, but it's the MHP, the Nationalist Party, that has the manpower in the security forces. So like the police, we've seen clashes between the MHP nationalist judges and judges loyal to Erdogan. So while Erdogan's hold over institutions seems near complete, there is this potential for, if there were ever to be a rift between him and his nationalist partners, and there's no sign that there is one, that his junior national ruling partners do wield a lot of influence in the sort of security apparatus, in the judiciary. So just want to make that point about the state power. And then when it comes to the media, we have, according to Reporters Without Borders, 9 out of 10 mainstream newspapers and news channels are either owned outright or controlled outright by the government, or are owned by companies that are close to Erdogan. So, for instance, during the protests, as far as that, we were watching, nature documentaries on these channels. They were not showing them. but you do have a handful of news channels that are opposition controlled, and they're stridently opposition, that they're very much focused on it. They are under pressure. They're being fined right now. One has been suspended from broadcast, I think it was 3 or 4 days. So they might be back on air now. So if people want to, they still can search out and find this very loud, very strident, very critical coverage of Erdogan and his government. And then obviously social media also plays a role here, but it's important to note that the government does wield quite a bit of control over that too. Right after Imamoglu was arrested, the internet was throttled. WhatsApp, Facebook, actually I don't know about Facebook, but YouTube and Twitter and Instagram all went down. We couldn't access it for days. During the protests, they were jammed. You couldn't access social media or really much of the internet from the protest sites. So they've also filed several content removal demands through court orders with Twitter. And even though Twitter has said that they're fighting them, by Twitter I mean X, even though Elon Musk's X has said they're fighting them, a lot of people are saying, these critical voices have gone offline, that their accounts have been removed. And I haven't verified myself, but that's a widespread belief that actually those sites have been removed. So it's a very difficult media environment. People don't have access to all the information. If you are watching the state news, those channels that are close to the state, Imamoglu sounds like a very, very shady character who is involved, with corruption, and is, also accused of terrorism, of paying groups money that then paid that money on to armed militants who are based mainly in northern Iraq. So it just depends. If you are curious and you are interested, there is an opportunity to seek out other information here. But most people still rely on watching the state TV news.
So state TV still has a dominant position. There's still a sort of tradition of watching the evening news or listening to the radio. And
it's, for a lot of people, it's still their BBC in a way. Like, it's reliable. It's a state, even though, it's, I find it probably the least partisan of a lot of these pro-government news channels, but it's by no means thorough in its coverage. It doesn't give any space to the opposition. There's, records on this, like during an election in which for every, hour of speeches by Erdogan that the state broadcaster shows, it shows about a minute of the opposition. So it's really imbalanced, but it definitely shapes the way people view this, especially for those people who are outside of Istanbul. Imamoglu might be an interesting character to them, but they haven't lived and seen what he's done for the city or hasn't done for the city. They can only really judge from afar, and that has to be done through the media. And it's not necessarily a very sterling picture that's being presented of him.
Okay. I'd love to get some questions. We've just got over 15 minutes to go in this session. So if you've got questions, please do put them down in the Q&A box, or just simply raise your hand. Those buttons should be at the bottom of your screen. You might want to ask about foreign affairs, comparisons with what's going on in the US. That might be a question. Just far away. Ayla, I've got to ask, you've been in Turkey for how long now? You've been there for a long time.
Yeah, I've been here since around the time that Erdogan first came to power. Let's put it that way. So it's about a little more than 20 years. Wow. So I've been, and I always would think, there's been a few times over the years where I thought, okay, it's time to move on. I've looked at jobs and thought about moving elsewhere. And I've thought to myself, no, I want to see how this story ends.
He's got staying power.
I think he's going to outlive me.
So, I mean, the question for me really is, I mean, you've covered some very difficult and tense periods. As you said, the coup in 2016, the Gezi Park protests, the clampdowns that followed after both of them. How does this feel to you as a reporter? We know that the BBC's correspondent Guy Delorney was kicked out. I mean, this must be concerning at the moment.
Yeah. No, the treatment of the press during these protests has been very alarming. As you said, the BBC correspondent, who was a Turkey-based correspondent for a long time and covered this country, with care and, deep understanding and knowledge, he was deported. There's also been a Swedish journalist who was arrested, I think at the airport, actually, when he arrived to try and cover the protests because of a criminal complaint against him over his coverage back home in Sweden of Kurdish dissidents there. So Turkey, I mean, that seems to me to be a legal mess. Like, how is this coverage there a violation of laws here? But these are very strong and deliberate messages that they're trying to send to the media.
Was he arrested? Was he detained? Was he sent back?
He was arrested. He's been charged with terrorism-related crimes.
And he's in custody still. He's there now.
As far as I know, I mean, unless he's been released somehow today, but no. And I'm sure that Sweden's working hard to get some clarity on this. But also there were about a dozen Turkish journalists who were arrested while covering the protests. Another dozen who were injured by police covering the protests. And for those who were detained and charged, their photographs of that they produced for their respective outlets was used against them as evidence that they were engaged in incitement to criminal activity, was the charge against them. So I don't think that's an accident. They were raided. Their houses were, the police came to their houses before dawn to pick them up and haul them away. So I think that was a deliberate message. I will say that, this has been true in past moments of crises here in Turkey, that my Turkish colleagues bear the brunt of this. Yes, there's been, obviously with the Swedish journalist, with Mark Lone of the BBC, an AFP photographer was among those who were arrested. The foreign press is able to operate much more comfortably than my Turkish colleagues. So I just want to say that they really are under an immense amount of pressure. So yeah. And how does this, this comes at a time where we live in a more restricted environment than we did in 2013, or at the moment of the coup. Following the coup, emergency rule was imposed, and the sort of Erdogan's swerve into authoritarianism really takes off after that. But up until that moment, we lived in a much more liberal environment. I mean, again, with restrictions, but these protests are occurring when Turkey ranks at the bottom of all sorts of freedom indices, including, I think it ranks at the 158th on Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. It's rated as not free by Freedom House. So it makes it difficult to cover the protests. The protests happening at all is remarkable because of this. 2,000 people have been arrested for protesting. Most of them are students. These are university kids, and according to their lawyers, are being treated quite badly. Actually, there are allegations that they've been assaulted, and there's also claims by some lawyers that they're being they're in cells with violent criminals. So they're being treated harshly, let's say, according to reports.
Yeah, okay. I've got Alex Norris has popped online there too, and Alex, if you've got any additional questions, we're going to chivvy our followers along here because I haven't got any questions in the Q&A box. I got tons of questions, and I'll keep on going. Alex, can you chip in? Have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is so interesting. I just wanted to ask, have you seen in the past or currently Erdogan's party sort of moderate its stances in response to what they see as rising opposition? So in this case, do you foresee, or have you seen already, any indications that they tend to sort of preemptively address some of the problems that they see that their opponents are running on?
That's a great question. I mean, Erdogan's part of his political success is that he is very adaptable, and he can a position that he seems to be ready, ready to die for, he will do a 180 the next week. In fact, after his party's setback in last year's local election, which I talked about, he talked about a softening. He talked about an outreach. And in the fall, they began a very opaque and difficult to understand process of reaching some kind of peace deal with the Kurdish militants. So there might be other reasons why he's decided to pursue that rather than a kind of relaxation or a liberalization, but I wouldn't rule it out is what I'm trying to say. That said, the concerns of protests, what they've been, at least the demands that I've heard them say, what I've heard them express, are things that are very serious. They're worried that this is the end of Turkish democracy. And Erdogan has shown no sign that he hears that concern. He's described the protests as street terrorism. That's the harsh end. He's also called it a theater or a show. But in both instances, he's clearly not hearing their calls. So it would be surprising if he were to, unless he feels somehow compelled. It's rare that an authoritarian leader suddenly has a change of heart so late into the game. But
where are you from, Ayla? Just to state the obvious.
Sure. So I was born and raised in the U.S. in the Midwest near Chicago, but I have a strong Turkish connection. My mom is from Istanbul. So when I first moved here, when I moved here for a job I moved here for a job with the Associated Press initially. The idea was I wanted to get to know, my roots, I guess. But now it's been so long. I think I qualify as Turkish at this point. So.
Okay. And look at the United States now. You spoke about, restrictions on the universities. We're talking about, the United States is way, way off what Turkey represents now. But looking at your home or where you've come from, do you see any little sneaking parallels? And you can bat this question away. You can say, this is completely unfair. This is not my bailiwick at all. Up to you.
No, I'm happy to answer it. And, it's something that I've been worried about for a long time. There was a former Turkish prime minister, a late Turkish prime minister, Süleyman Demirel, who talked in a very aspirational way about how he hoped to, quote, make Turkey the little America, was how he did it. And a common joke now is, here we were trying to be little America, and America's a big Turkey. So it's not just me, but a lot of people see quite a few parallels. I think a really important point to make is that one major difference between Erdogan and Trump is that Erdogan plays a much longer game. So he has been around for 2 decades, and his control of most state institutions took years and years, whereas Trump is kind of just barreling right in there to take control of, what he calls the deep state, also a Turkish term that comes from, that's Turkish political, a Turkish political lexicon. So, but I do see similarities. And I think that, people can look at, if they don't know Turkey very well, this is understandable. They might look at it as, well, it's a poor country. It has a completely different history. It might be a little bit even dismissive of Turkey. It's Middle Eastern, it's Muslim. But if Turkey had incredibly strong institutions, the military not only staged 3 outright coups, but staged a fourth bloodless one in the late 90s. It exerted huge amount of clout over governments here. And even that's been sort of brought to heel under Erdogan. So if, whether it's the judiciary, whether it was the police force, these were, this is a country that, and also, in terms of its democracy, has had a imperfect democracy for the last 75 years. That's a long time. And so if these things can happen in Turkey, my feeling has always been they can happen anywhere, including the United States.
Hi, Ayla. It's a fascinating talk. I'm sure everyone would say that if they could speak to you. I just wanted to ask you a bit about the situation with inflation and the cost of living problem and people on low incomes.
Mm-hmm.
So, was there any protest or opposition about that over the last, year or so before the latest events? And what's happened to those issues now?
That's a great point. And, interestingly, no, there was at least not widespread protest. There were small events, with labor action. So you'd have a company facing a walkout of their staff over wages, things like that. But by no means, no mass protests. And I think that that's quite telling. It shows you that people don't have that much faith in the streets, taking to the streets and that yielding results. Also, because there have been 2 elections recently, like in 2023, there was a general election in which Erdogan was reelected. And then last year, the local elections, I think people also have a lot of faith in the ballot box here. So rather than go and, take to the streets and run, and with all the risks that carries, including arrest, there was a sense that, we'll deal with this at the ballot box. I think that maybe because elections are so far off now, and this economic crisis has been so long and grinding, that might be another reason why people took to the streets to support Imamoglu. But what really is the catalyst here is that a very popular opposition figure, someone who is seen as a serious challenger to Erdogan for the first time in 20 years, is not going to be allowed to compete, that he's just being taken off. And I think very few people believe that the charges have much merit. We don't really know because it's a secret investigation, which is strange, that there's, for some reason, we're not being allowed to. The justice minister met with members of the press last week, and I asked him, I said, you say that there's a secrecy order around this, but at the same time, you're saying that, that these are very grave charges, these are very serious. What is it about it that requires him to be held in pretrial detention until his court case begins? And he didn't elaborate, but he did say things that were kind of surprising. Well, there was a risk, a flight risk was one thing that they cited. So they have the justice minister, the prosecutor can point to the secrecy order for saying that's, we can't really comment on it. But a lot of the investigation, the documents from it have been leaked. And from what we can see, there isn't that much of merit. It's a lot of secret witnesses, unidentified people saying that there's 2 things he's accused of. And I've ventured far off your question, so I can stop. But I'll really quickly explain what the charges he's facing. One is like a series of graft-related charges regarding tender rigging and bribes. But again, we haven't seen anything in the documents that have emerged that would show a strong case against him. Things like one of his aides gave money to a family that was in need, and they're saying that somehow was a kickback, for instance. And then the other one is terrorism related. He's accused of terrorism because members of his team met with the pro-Kurdish opposition ahead of the last year's local election to talk about strategy and how, we'll support your candidate in this district if you support our, I think very standard politicking in a lot of countries where you don't, you make alliances as you go to the ballot box. And he's being accused of terrorism for that because he's accused of somehow passing money on then to the PKK. So sorry to have gone off track, Rebecca, but if there's anything else you want to know about the economy, I'm happy to answer it.
Oh, no, that was great. Thank you.
There we have to leave it, folks. Our time is up. It sounds to me as though Erdogan is going nowhere, definitely not leaving his presidential palace. And is going to be in a very strong position to fight an election, even though the Constitution bars it, doesn't it, in 2028?
That's another element. Yes, it does. He is hemmed in by term limits, but we, in this very tense environment, there's talk of drafting a new constitution now. His allies want to see that those term limits abolished. The other option is for Parliament to call snap elections. For both of those things, though, he lacks the supermajority that he needs. So there's questions about whether and how he'll run in 2028.
Yeah. Well, Ayla, we're very much hoping that we can come to Turkey with you as we have done previously, and I hope we can schedule a full tour to Turkey next year. Let's see how things go. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.